In the first video for this next session, we're going to talk in more detail about segmentation, and then we're going to move on to talk about targeting and positioning and differentiation. It's really important when we're designing a marketing strategy that's all about our customer and aligning with what our customer needs and wants and values, that we think about what customers that we're going to go after, and the practices of understanding what customers we're going to go after is the practice of segmenting and targeting our audiences, and then developing differentiation and positioning strategies based on that segmentation and targeting strategy. So segmentation is really all about breaking down the general population or groups of buyers into smaller, more manageable groups based on their needs or their traits or their behaviors that might actually require separate or different marketing strategies or marketing mixes in order to be effective or meaningful for each of those individuals within those groups. This is a great exam question. There are four broad ways or strategies that you can use to segment the markets. And we're going to go over those four strategies right now. The first way to segment the market is by using geographic segmentation. This is dividing up potential customers based on some sort of geographic parameter. So it could be dividing up customers for a product like Coca-Cola by the countries that they live in. So Canadians who buy Coca-Cola are different, presumably, than Japanese consumers who buy Coca-Cola, who may be different than Brazilian consumers who buy Coca-Cola. So you could divide up the market based on countries or even regions of a country. East Coast Canadians are a different type of consumer group in many respects compared to West Coast Canadians. And so you may want to divide up, if it makes sense for your business, to divide up consumers based on those parameters. Again, if there's meaningful differences that are relevant to your business, that might work. You can divide up consumers based on provinces or cities, or even neighborhoods in cities. For example, if you are a pizza restaurant and you're thinking of, well, who should we send or mail out flyers to about our menu or upcoming specials, you may use neighborhood segmentation because you're not likely to send menus to people who live in neighborhoods that are quite a distance from your pizza restaurant, because they're likely not going to order pizza from you because they're not in close proximity. So the kind of geographic segmentation that you might embark on really depends on the nature of your business. In some cases, large geographic groupings make a lot of sense if you are a company that has a large national or global presence, and then you can group those people in that geographic unit as very similar. That might make sense. In other cases, it makes more sense to divide them into smaller groups. Geographic segmentation is super easy to do. It's very, very cost effective. The problem with geographic segmentation is that it assumes everyone within that geographic segmentation, every buyer, is similar. And we just know that's not true. I mean, if you look at the Greater Charlottetown area, for example, you cannot really assume that everyone who lives in the Greater Charlottetown area is similar in the way that they value or purchase every single kind of product. The fact of the matter is that we're very, very different. And so one of the shortcomings of geographic segmentation is that it does treat everybody within that geographic unit as being the same, when we know that that's really not very truthful. The reason it's done, or the reason companies choose this strategy, is because it's super easy to do. The next kind of segmentation strategy is called demographic segmentation, and this is all about breaking down or grouping consumers or buyers into groups based on things like age or gender or where they are in their life cycle, grouping them based on annual household income or different ethnic or cultural groups. Again, this is a very common way that many companies segment their markets, because again, it is relatively easy to break people down based on these sort of general demographic characteristics. It's easy to assume to break consumers down into male consumers and female consumers. But again, just like with geographic segmentation, the danger becomes making the assumption that all women consumers are the same, or all male consumers are the same. Or if you break people down by age category, you're assuming all people in their 20s are the same when it comes to making purchases and what they value. And the reality is, again, that's not really true. Um, yes, there are some similarities in many cases when it comes to demographic groupings, um, but it's not nearly as nuanced as other kinds of segmentation, which we're going to get into in a minute. Again, it's very, very common for companies to do this because it's very, very easy for them to do, not because it's necessarily particularly effective. Unlike the previous two types of segmentation strategies, geographic and demographic, psychographic segmentation is actually much more effective and much more impactful in terms of a way of breaking down consumers into important consumer segments or groups. The challenge, of course, is that it's a lot more difficult to do. So you can break people down into groups based on social class or lifestyle or personality characteristics, for example. Um, but in order to do that, you have to actually be able to capture really important information about consumers that historically has not been all that easy to capture. So understanding the personalities of the consumers that you're going after prior to the digital age and social media was actually a very difficult prospect, and companies didn't have the resources to do that kind of thing. And so historically, psychographic segmentation wasn't really used all that much, or as much in comparison to demographic or geographic segmentation. However, with the explosion in the use of social media and our ability to capture these kinds of personality uh, measures or personality indicators using the analytical tools that are built into social media platforms, it's actually making it a whole lot easier for companies to segment their markets using psychographic characteristics. What they're finding is that it actually is a much more powerful and much more meaningful tool for effectively targeting consumers. And the last kind of segmentation strategy, behavioral segmentation, is also uh, a much more effective and impactful way of segmenting the market. Just like psychographic segmentation, this kind of segmentation is actually growing in terms of its usage. In large part because now companies have access to data that enable them to track your behavior, your consumer behavior, and that thus enables them to group people based on certain behavioral characteristics. So you can group people based on the occasion for which they're making purchases. You can group people based on the benefits that they seek from your product. So, for example, if you're a car manufacturer, you can group people based on those customers who are looking for style and sort of the appearance of the car, and that's what they value, versus people who are looking for fuel efficiency or performance. So you can group people that way. You can group them based on user status. Have they used your product before? Have they never used the product before? Are they a former user who have stopped using your product? So you can group them that way. You can group them on the rate at which they use their product. So, for example, Starbucks, it could be, you could group people based on your once a month, once a week, once a day, twice a day, that kind of usage rate. And you can also segment people based on loyalty status. And that's why we're seeing, again, this growth in loyalty programs from a lot of companies. It's really so that they can track your consumer behavior and then do a better job of segmenting and targeting you when it comes to marketing. In order to segment markets, it's really important to remember one thing. Just because you can break your market down into smaller, more meaningful groups doesn't mean that you should. You should only segment the market into smaller groups if there's meaningful differences between the groups. If you break a group down into two different groups, but essentially those two groups are more or less the same, then there's really no value in breaking that larger group down into those two smaller groups. In order to be effective, market segments must be measurable. You should be able to know roughly the number of people in that market segment and how much money they spend on average on purchases that are relevant to your business. You should be able to access these people. If you have no means of communicating or connecting with a particular market segment, it doesn't make sense to separate them out as being a segment that you may want to consider targeting. It should be big enough, substantial enough that it warrants its own segmentation, its own potential marketing strategy. It should be different, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Each segment should be different in a meaningful way. And if they're not different in a meaningful way, why are you in fact separating them out? And you should be able to develop four using the 4P strategies, actionable marketing initiatives or strategies designed specifically to meet the unique needs of that particular segment of your market. We're going to pause here